All right, I want to start with a movie and a musical. So the movie is from 2002. It was a movie called Wind Talkers. Did anybody watch Wind Talkers, that movie? It was World War II themed. I don't think it was a particularly acclaimed movie. I think Nicolas Cage was in it, which means it probably was not an acclaimed movie. But the theme wasn't, and you probably know some of the story of this. The Japanese were breaking every code we could come up with. So communicating information in war needs to be in code, and it's really tough when your enemy can crack those codes, every one of them, except for the Navajo translators. Because of the complicated dialects or probably lots of things in language that I don't understand, the Japanese were not able to crack that code when we would encode things in the Navajo language. So those translators were very, very valuable. So that's what that movie is about. Came out in 2002, and I didn't watch the movie, but I heard an interview with a World War II veteran who watched the movie, and his comments on it were very interesting to me. First, there's a couple comments he had that were interesting. First, he said, it's a little contrived if you watch the movie because the plot is such that these translators were so valuable. If they were captured by the enemy, then the soldiers were basically ordered to kill the translator. And the soldier said, no, that's Hollywood. Like, you would never be ordered to kill an officer in the armed services. But the second thing that he said, for the purposes of this message, that I think is interesting is, after he watched the movie, he said, we didn't talk that way. And the interviewer said, what did you mean? He said, well, it was war, and I'm not going to say we were perfect, but the language that's in that movie, the obscenities, the profanities, the vulgarities, that's not accurate. We didn't talk that way. And that was interesting to me because, this is everything about this is before my time, and you just assume, okay, war is hell, and people are gonna talk, with vulgarities, but apparently it's not the case. In the old days, there was more a sense of propriety and maybe virtue even in some ways. And I think that's probably true in a lot of different ways. In the old days, there were some things that we certainly have lost when it comes to virtue and propriety and things like that. I know that when I watch a movie or invest in a TV show, I kind of, probably like you, I just have to accept the fact that there's going to be a lot of objectionable things that I'm going to experience in that, unless it's like the Great British Baking Show or Repair Shop or something like that, which we love. It's probably going to contain some things that aren't safe for work. Or I don't watch them. Those are really my two options. But there used to be a time when there wasn't so much vulgarity and profanity in the world. Kind of lost that, and probably lost a lot of other things too. Responsibility, perhaps, sense of responsibility, a sense of decency in some ways, and all that I believe is very, very true. But if you feel like I'm setting you up for something, I am, because that's the movie that I wanted to mention. There's a musical I want to mention, and this came out 10 years after World War II was over, and it was based on the book called The Year the Yankees Lost the Pennant. And it's a musical about baseball. Tyson, do you want to share with everyone what the title of this musical is? He doesn't want to. Because I just railed about profanities. And
the birds are a little bit loud. I'm sorry, I can't share.
Well, at any rate, we're going to call it the Cursed Yankees. That's the way we're going to call it. Just because I don't get paid to be profane and vulgar on Sunday mornings. So there's a song in this. It's a Faustian story, this musical. So there's an older man who makes a deal with the devil. He sells his soul so that he can become a young baseball player who will help to beat those cursed Yankees. And I was actually in this musical years ago. In a former life, I was a musician, and I got to play the most fun role. And if you're an actor, the most fun roles are not the heroes. The heroes often are very plain, vanilla, and boring. Not always, but often. But the complicated characters, the fun characters, are the villains. And I got to play the biggest villain. I got to play the devil in the Cursed Yankees. And his name is Mr. Applegate, which I thought was very clever. Going back to Genesis chapter 3, the apple was the gate into sin. This is Mr. Applegate. And he sings a song. The devil's big song in this musical is called "Those Were the Good Old Days," in which he delights in all of the horrible things that have happened in the good old days. So if you will indulge me for a couple verses of this song. This is the devil singing about the times when things were better. He sings, "I see Bonaparte, a mean one, if ever I seen one, and Nero fiddling through that lovely blaze, Antoinette, dainty queen, with her quaint guillotine, ah ha ha ha, those were the good old days." Second verse is just a little bit racist when it comes to Native Americans, but you would expect the devil to be a little bit racist. "I see Indians a-dragging an empty covered wagon, when scalping the settlers was the latest craze, and that glorious morn Jack the Ripper was born, ha 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 ha, those were the good old days." You get the picture. The point is, the old days, whether they were good or not, truly depends on your perspective, who you are, and what exactly you're reveling in, which I think now needs to bring us to our scriptures for the day. We've talked about movies and musicals. It's probably a good idea at some point to talk about scripture. Numbers chapter 21 and John chapter 3. These are connected in our lectionary readings for the week, but they're connected for a much better reason than that. Jesus connected these two scriptures. When Jesus is speaking to Nicodemus in John chapter 3, in what to us would become the most famous verses in our culture, John 3:16 and maybe 17. But before he says that, before he says, "For God so loved the world," he says, Numbers 21. And he compares and says that we need to be people that are healed like a Numbers 21 people. Now, the context of that is grumbling in the desert. And we know that old story. Moses says them wandering through the desert, and they're not happy. The Hebrews are not happy about this. And what do they say? The good old days. Moses, we want the good old days. And in order to do that, they had to ignore reality on a number of different levels, didn't they? They had to ignore the past, the present, and the future of their reality. They had to ignore the past of let's acknowledge a few things. Things were better in Egypt in some ways. Let's give them a little bit of credit. They had houses that they didn't have to carry on their backs or load onto their donkeys, right? They didn't have to set up a tent every time they wanted to have a roof over their head, okay? They had that God had provided for them. They had more available water than they had in the desert. Probably 400 years there, they set up, villages and neighborhoods and probably just enjoyed their neighbors on some level. And all that is probably true and valid, that it was the desert. Also true, slavery, right? Also true, they were worked to the bone by Pharaoh. Also true, he was trying to kill them. He was trying to kill them by the way he made them make bricks without straw. He was trying to kill them, work them to death. He was trying to kill their firstborn sons. Depending on how you read it, either he was trying to or he actually did. This is just brutal to even think about, but it just kill their newborn first sons, go down to the Nile and basically feed them to the crocodiles. What an awful, and to ignore that and say, hey, things were better in Egypt. They're ignoring that reality. Also ignoring the fact that, they were in the transition time right there. Egypt wasn't the promised land. And the wilderness, Moses never said the wilderness was the promised land. This is what we're walking through in order to get to the promised land. So we're in an in-between time right now, is what they should have had that reality, and they should have had the reality on their mind that the future was the promised land was to come. It wasn't behind them. It wasn't what they were experiencing right now, but it was in front of them. And I think, we're very, we're right to try to apply this to us. And if we see ourselves in the story, we're the grumbling Hebrews in this story. We're the grumbling Hebrews because that's who Jesus compared us to. Which, side note, in this story, Jesus compares himself to an animal that is very unexpected to most of us. If you asked me to compare Jesus to an animal, I would probably say lion, lamb, maybe one of the sacrificial animals from the temple or something like that. But Jesus compares himself to a snake in this passage. The snake is a type. The snake, this bronze snake on a pole, is a type of Jesus. And while Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, while he's teaching a teacher, he compares the people who need him, which would be us, the followers of the Lord, to these grumbling people in the desert. And for us to have this mentality about the good old days, I think we have to do the same three things. We have to ignore the past, the present, the future. We have to ignore some realities about the past, the present, the future. Now let's acknowledge that some things in the past were better. We've listed some of those this morning. You could watch something without wondering if it was safe for work or safe for your kids or grandkids. There just wasn't nearly so much profanity and vulgarity in the world. It just seems it's so prevalent right now. Probably there's levels of responsibility in some ways. Probably there's levels of virtue that have been that are not what they used to be. Also true, during those old days, we might call them good old days. Some people might, but I'm just going to call them the old days. During those old days, women couldn't vote or own property. Our Black neighbors or neighborhoods couldn't get loans for their houses. Victims of sexual assault were often told, hey, shut up and take one for the team, all right? Those kinds of things happened, and they're real. And to call that the good old days, I think ignores some reality, certainly for some people. Now, the present right now reality is not the promised land for us, and we know this as Christians. And by the way, I'm applying this to us as Christians, not necessarily as Americans, because the Bible wasn't written to Americans. The Bible was written to followers of the Lord. I'm going to say Christians. And so if we can think of the Christians, in the old days weren't the promised land. That's just not reality. This isn't the promised land. The promised land is to come. The promised land is when Jesus glorifies us and the consummation of the universe happens. That is in our future. We're in this in-between land right now. And so let's get a grasp on where we are, where we've been, where we're going, and not try to think about the past as something that it's not. Now I'm going to try to keep this short here. And so here's the convicting thing for me. Here's the statement that, to me, when I've wrestled with this all week, here's the statement that really kind of just gets me in the splagna. For the Hebrews, if they were to ignore realities and call the past the good old days, they were ignoring some very, very bad things that happened to them. Okay. But if everybody sees who I am and what I look like right now, if I ignore realities of the past, or if I call the good old days, if I call the old days the good old days, I'm ignoring the bad things that happen to other people. And I'm basically saying those days were better for me. I don't care if they were better for you or not. I don't care if you were at the back of the bus. I don't care if if you didn't have the same legal rights that I did. They were better for me, and I like them better. And that's very convicting for me to have that perspective. There's a verse that comes from Ecclesiastes that comes to mind here. I'm going to read it so I don't misquote it. Ecclesiastes 7:10. Do not say, why is it that the former days were better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask about this. So I think this really naturally, and one of the reasons I like this format right now is that we flow straight from this, dovetails beautifully into communion right here. Because it's really hard to do a negative. Basically, this far I said, hey, those were the good old days. I think we're singing the wrong song, almost literally. I think we're singing the wrong song when we say that. But it's hard to do a negative, isn't it? Matter of fact, it's impossible to do a negative. If somebody says don't do this, by definition, you're not doing anything. But remember what Jesus said in John chapter 3. Remember the instructions in Numbers 21 to the Hebrews. It was look to what is lifted up. Lifted up, if I understand biblical language correctly, lifted up is code for lifted up on a cross. You know, we think about Jesus high and lifted up and some of those praise songs that we sing, but lifted up means lifted up on a cross. And Jesus was lifted up on a cross. And he compares that to the bronze serpent that was lifted up so that people could look to it and be healed. So the solution then is not to not call the old days the good old days, because that's a negative. And yeah, sure, maybe we should stop. But the solution really is look to Jesus. Don't look to the past. Don't look to my selfish desires. Don't look to some rose-colored version of something. Certainly don't overlook the suffering of other people historically around us, but look to Jesus, and specifically look to his sacrifice. Man, that's why I love that we get to do this every time we gather. I love that the solution to my selfishness, the solution to me saying, a solution to me feeling like, oh, this would be better for me if things were the way they were, is to look to what Jesus has done and to how I can be like him. Look at it, and I think that was the passage that we read in Numbers 21. Look and live. Look at Jesus and live. Whenever the Israelites looked at that serpent, they didn't die from those venomous snakes, but they lived. And whoever looks to Jesus on the cross by accepting him and his atoning death lives spiritually and eternally. So that's our solution, and that's what we do. That's what we do at this time. We remember his sacrifice. We remember his death, and we remember how effective that is for us in our lives. So if you've got your element,